Thank you very much. This will honestly be the last presentation, so you soon will be relieved. But I still hope there are some gray cells left to follow our presentation. We're gonna talk about what we found about the link between constrained government and education in terms of how that relationship affects participation rates in European countries during the crisis. And also have to admit that the title is a little bit misleading, so excuse for that. We think we have found one hidden side of turnout, not as we imply here, the hidden side. We have found an effect we find intriguing, but there are for sure is more out there in terms of explaining different outcomes in terms of participation. We're from the University of Zurich, and Thomas Kurer is a PhD student on this project, and we will give the presentation together. I will first talk, give a brief introduction on the theory and the theoretical arguments underlying the analysis, and Thomas will then talk about the results we found. We started this project with the ambition to add something to the growing literature on the effects of the crisis in terms of legitimacy and responsiveness of elections. Is there any change in terms of how well people are represented in elections, and are there any major shifts in turnout levels? Exactly what we found, like by looking through the cases anecdotally, is that there are neither clear trends of upward trends in participation, nor systematic shifts in withdrawal in dependence on the impact of the economic crisis. So you have, for example, you have Greece, where turnout levels sharply decline. You have, but on the other hand, you have Ireland, where you have you see increased turnout levels. Same for not as hard or not really hit countries. You have declining turnout in Germany, for example, and upward trends in some Scandinavian countries. So there seems to be no clear pattern on the aggregate level. We then thought, okay, if there's an impact of the crisis on participation, then we should distinguish effects and mechanisms for different social groups, which led us to a study on education as the most important resource for participation. And here the literature basically, there's a large literature out there, and basically what they say is that in all situations, in all contexts, it should be expected that less privileged citizens in terms of sophistication should also participate less. This is one of the strongest findings in the literature so far. What we think is new now during elections during the economic crisis is that we also have strong constrained government effects. That is, governments which are or cannot really be blamed for harsh economic conditions, at least in the perceptions of citizens. And we think that this conditionality of government constraint should have an effect on the expectations of people, whether it's worth the cost to go to the polls or not. simply because if I as a voter assume that no matter which party I elect to government, there's no change in economic policy, I rather decide to not go to vote. This is the simple baseline of our second assumption. Putting these things together, we think that the anticipation of government's constraint is somewhat requires some sophistication and knowledge. We're soon going to talk how we operationalize government constraint, but we believe that mostly well-educated people understand like financial market constraints, constraints induced by conditionality agreements with donors like the European Commission or the International Monetary Fund. And that's why we believe that mostly well-educated people abstain from voting when their government is heavily constrained by political and economic constraints. Our first take on this hypothesis is to look at the European Social Survey, and we took the round 5. Unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, round 6 was released, but we didn't have time to look into it, but we will, because this will be very interesting for us to have 2 time points. And we simply run hierarchical regression models in the countries we could collect data. These are 22 countries. We have that in the paper if you're interested. There are countries from all regions of Europe, and we have some 28,000 respondents in these countries. And what really is interesting for us is whether macro level indicators of government constraint, this is public deficit or government bond yields and conditionality agreements, whether these constraint indicators interact with the effect of education on participation. So the cross-level interaction is really interesting for us. We have pretty much a standard multi-level model, except that we include the social and economic risks, not at the individual or national level, but we have occupational operationalization of employment risks. So we have a variable measuring how large the risk is that an individual from a certain occupational group gets unemployed. And we we do this by means of the EU Silk data set. Then on the macro level, we also include like standard control variables like the GDP and the differentiation between Eastern and Western Europe, which is very important with regards to turnout levels. And yeah, this is what we find, and Thomas will now elaborate more on that.
Yeah, we agree with Team Iceland. The pictures are nicer to look at than tables, so we spare you that one and go directly to some graphical evidence. What you see here is this is our 4 measures of government constraints. So this in the upper left is our main measure, is a factor consisting of deficit, conditionality, and government bond yields. And when we look at this, this is predicted probabilities for voting, for electoral participation, for different levels of education, and dependent on government constraints on different levels. And when we look at this, like our main measure here, the upper 2 slopes, this is the normal picture for countries with low or medium levels of constraints. So we have what is expected in standard literature. We have this positive effect of education. The higher the education, the higher the probability to go to the polls. Where really something happens is the third line, the horizontal line here. and this is predicted probabilities for voting in severely constrained countries. So this is exactly what we expected, that these education effects get substantially moderated by external constraints when people, or especially the highly educated, anticipate the inefficacy of their national governments. So the probability to go to the polls is exactly the same for high and low educated. And we see that this result is not dependent on a specific measure of government constraints. So we have very similar overall pictures for here. This is conditionality. This is simply a dummy whether the IMF took over or not. We see that education effects get moderated here, lower levels of this effect. The same is true for government bond yields. The higher the bond yields, the less steep the slope. And the most extreme effect we see when we measure government constraints by deficit. What we see up here is this is the case of Ireland that had very high level of deficit in 2010, and we see that the education effect is even reversed. So highly educated citizens in Ireland 2010 had a lower probability to go voting than low educated. So this is the first thing we want to mention here, and the second one is that what is also pretty much in line with our reasoning is that government constraint only matters for highly sophisticated voters. So at the left side of this plot, there is almost no difference between different levels of constraint, but when we turn to the right, these slopes really have a big difference between each other. Then we have a second, some more graphical evidence. This here is now marginal effects of education on voting for different level of constraints. It's the same for variables as shown before. And here we want to focus a bit more on critical values. So at what point these constraints really get critical. And for instance here, in the case of deficit, we see that around 10% deficit of GDP, the marginal effects get insignificant. So there is no more difference between high and low educated voters. The same is true for conditionality. So this again is just a dummy. So as soon as the IMF or the Troika took over, there is no more significant effect here. It's not different from zero anymore. And in terms of bond yields, we see that around at the level of about 6% bond yields, this effect disappears. And what we also see here on these plots is the distribution of countries, and we have to emphasize here that all these effects are not systematically driven by single extreme cases like Ireland or Greece, but all the effects are robust to the exclusion of these cases, and the results are not altered whether in neither direction nor significance. So we already come to our conclusion. We started from this observation of different patterns of turnout in hard times, and also rather inconclusive literature, whether there is a mobilization or a withdrawal effect. And therefore we turn to the second explanatory variable, the education, and we really found that education in highly constrained countries, or in countries run by highly constrained governments, this education effect disappeared. So this might be another source of lower turnout rates, and not only the losers of the crisis, which is usually focused at, is the main source of explanation. And this also has some normative ramifications. To end our presentation, one might argue that this, which is actually a narrowing of the participation gap between high and low educated citizens, this could also be interpreted as a nice thing, because the representativeness of democracy is increased, but obviously this comes at the cost of lower overall turnout rates, and from a theoretical perspective, we don't think that this is a desirable outcome.